Nerfs are here. Let's talk about it. Hey guys, what's cracking? It's Krakenation, and that's right, the Hearthstone Savers of Uldum nerfs are upon us. Hearthstone's been, the Blizzard staff has been incredibly on top of nerfs in the past, I'd say past year or so. In really long ago, not really long ago, but before that, the Blizzard staff would take weeks to make nerfs and weeks for the nerfs to come out after announcement. And these things would just take so long, and were sometimes kind of met with disapproval from the community. But it's really cool they're doing it so fast. But without further ado, let's talk about some of these nerfs, and a lot of them are, I think, pretty warranted and interesting to look at. So the first nerf we've got on the list is Conjurer's Calling. And Conjurer's Calling is going from 3 mana to 4 mana, and I think this was what by the community was most commonly proposed, and I think it makes, honestly, a lot of sense. Basically what this does is it pushes your Conjurer's Calling turns back. It makes it really hard to follow Mountain Giant up with Conjurer's Calling, so that Conjurer's Calling on 3, or Mountain Giant on 4, or Conjurer's Calling on 5, or double Conjurer's Calling on 6 with Khadgar, or those kinds of combos, like Mountain Giant on 4, Khadgar plus Conjurer on 5, is dead. And those combos were insane, and just creating, like the Blizzard staff talks about, boards that were just impossible to deal with that early in the game if the deck high rolled. And most importantly, the deck became this high roll deck, and the problem with high roll decks is people just don't like playing against them because it feels like they got beat by Hearthstone and not by their opponent, if that makes sense. So people don't like playing against that, and so what this does is it forces those combos all back late into the game. And effectively, because of Twin Spell, a 1 mana nerf to Conjurer's Calling is almost like a 1.5 mana nerf because of the second copy, right, if you think about it. So it's really interesting that you're going to end up spending 2 more mana total on this card, and that's going to make this card feel a lot harder to get out effectively. That said, this is still a really powerful effect, and I can't imagine this being the card that makes this deck bad still. I think this deck will still be good, albeit a little weaker, and also with the next card that got nerfed coming up, maybe a lot weaker. But Conjurer's Calling itself is definitely weaker and less impactful, but not significantly to the point where it cannot be played anymore. So next up, we've got Luna's Pocket Galaxy, and interestingly enough, Blizzard is taking this from the 5 mana spot back to 7 mana where it originally was before the Rise of the Mech event. So I think this is kind of an interesting philosophy change by Blizzard, where they acknowledge, I like that they did the buffs, but they acknowledge that we made a mistake by debuffing it, or by buffing it, and then we need to kind of re-nerf it. And that's pretty interesting. I do wonder if they went back too far, because 7 mana, we saw with the original Luna's Pocket Galaxy at 7 mana, just was not getting played almost at all. Incredibly hard to work into a deck. So I feel like 6 mana might have been a more appropriate place for this card. I think 6 mana might have been the perfect sweet spot, actually, if anything. Because now this card went from meta-defining and high-rolly and absurd win rates when played on curve, but terrible win rates when played off curve, to just basically pretty much trash all the time. This card was really bad, and it's going to continue to be really bad. So I really doubt that this card is going to see any play, and I think this one's dead. So I think variants of Mage that currently are running this card will stop running it and go down a different path. I'm very curious to see what that path is going to be. Like I said, Conjurer's Calling is not that bad still, but this is awful. So we're going to see what happens. Next up, we've got Warrior nerf, finally to Control Warrior, Dr.Boom, Mad Genius. Now, this card is awesome, and it's really fun to play, but it feels really bad to play against, because if you're not playing a fellow Control Warrior, you're just going to be grinded out of your brains. Like, this is really brutal, and if you haven't seen this on the meta, it means you haven't played Standard, because this card is everywhere and just grinding everyone out, and no deck can keep up with this much value, except my Druid deck. If you haven't seen that, check that out. But so they bump it up to 2 mana, and actually my thoughts are, now normally a 2 mana change, so especially to a card that you want to use a hero power on the same turn, is really impactful. But this doesn't feel that impactful because of the nature of deck that this is played in, if you think about it. So let me explain that. So you definitely can't flex in the new upgraded hero power on the turn you use it, and that's a very obvious downside. No argument there. But there's a significant point where these cards become bad, and that's when their impact in the game is completely changed. In this case, Dr. Boom being 9 mana doesn't make that much of a difference in the long term, because Dr. Boom you'll still be able to accrue lots of hero powers over the rest of the game after you play it. So only thing that makes this really affects is when an aggro deck or a tempo deck or some kind of maybe mid-range deck making a big push. These decks get shut out by earlier Dr. Booms. These decks, because of that 7 health extra gain because of the armor, those decks now match up slightly better. But in the control versus control matchup, I don't think this makes that much difference. So I think that's interesting because this is a more subtle change than 2 mana suggests. So I'm really curious to find what happens here. There were a lot of other suggestions from the community as far as how they should fix this card. The most common two, I think, were remove the gain 7 armor blast shield, which I think is interesting and creates an element of the inevitability of Dr. Boom disappearing because you lose armor gain for the most part. And then the other suggestion was changing the text in some way or another. Completely removing it would make this card awful, probably. So the other suggestion was cards in your, like the mechs in your hand and deck have rush instead of the new ones you generate off of Dr. Boom. I thought that was a really cool idea that would have worked really well. It kind of limited the power of the cards that this card was generating. But we'll see if what they did was enough. My feeling is that this deck will still be excellent at doing what it does, and only slightly worse against aggro matchups. So it's a very subtle change. We're going to have to keep an eye on this one. I wouldn't be shocked if in another 2 months or another month or so, this card was getting revisited again. So our next one is Priest, and this is another one like Luna's Pocket Galaxy that got buffed, became 2 mana, and now is going back to the original point. It's interesting to read the philosophy that Blizzard posted about this card, because they said that originally when we buffed this card, Priest was in an awful state that was getting no play. It was a weak class, and then we wanted to improve it, so we gave it this powerful card that would let it utilize its board-based strategies in the early game. But then with Sabers of Uldum, Priest has a lot more board-based strategies now, especially with things like Quest. The combo Priest decks now emerging, and this card was a key enabler to a lot of those. So I think with this going back to 3 mana, I don't think it's unplayable because combo deck's a tier 1 deck, so I wouldn't, and uses a lot of other strategies too, so I wouldn't be shocked if this only brings it down to maybe a tier 2 deck or something. But this definitely does impact the deck and make it a little weaker. Notably that the second copy, More Arms, is also 3 mana, so you're going to be going from 2 and 2 to 3 and 3. So that's worth remembering, and I think it's going to be a little bit of a nerf to Priest, but again, I like that some of these nerfs haven't been just completely killing cards. I don't think this card is dead, but it's definitely, because it wasn't a good card before, but I think that's more because Priest wasn't a good deck, a good class before. So I think because of the deck that this is in is pretty good, it has a chance to still see some play, which is nice. And finally, if you are a Wild player, unlike me, you're probably a lot more excited about this than I am, but I don't really care that much, but I'm going to talk about it a little because I have played a little Wild, but probably, again, not that much. Barnes was in Big Priest, just an absolute beast, because on turn 4, you could get your big res mechanics rolling, and then 5, 6, 7, you can start rolling out big res mechanics before you lost the board. It's curious to see now that with this being back a spot in mana, you're going to have a harder time flexing in turns and dealing with opponent's pressure early in the game. So I'm curious to see how that shakes out, but I'm not that curious, I should say, because I don't really play that much Wild. I think it's kind of just a little bit of a mess with how powerful everything is, and just kind of like oppressive with some of these big Priest style decks. So we'll see what shakes out with Wild. Maybe it'll be a class. This is a clear, huge nerf to Big Priest, especially because they can't control the board as early if they're getting Barnes out later. So I think this might make Wild a little more fun to play, if anything, because I'm really excited. But it is really still a good card, and I imagine Big Priest will still be a good deck, but this does create a significant impact to the high roll potential, which if we notice with a few of these decks, especially with the Barnes nerf and the Luna's Pocket Galaxy nerf, those high roll potentials are now very limited because those were some of the highest rolling decks we've seen on Hearthstone in a while. So I'm pretty excited with these nerfs. I'm expecting them to be out by early next week, which is always really cool. They get them out real fast now, and I'm excited to play some more decks. I think Hunter might just take over now, and I wouldn't be shocked if Hunter got some nerfs next round or something, because Hunter's technically the top class in the meta right now, and it did not get touched by any of these nerfs. So it's going to be powerful. It's going to be Hunter Stone soon. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, leave a comment, rate, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and make sure to stop in for all your Hearthstone related news. And until next time, I will see you guys later. Krakenation out.